The clash between Natasha and Muslim feminists in Canada. 1. Background of the conflict. Natasha, after surviving severe oppression and violence in Sudan and Saudi Arabia, becomes an outspoken activist and academic in Canada. She publishes books and gives public speeches exposing misogynistic practices in Muslim societies, such as female genital mutilation, child marriage, polygamy, and honor-based violence. Her work is based on both personal experience and field research. Muslim feminists in Canada, many of whom are academics or community leaders, take a very different approach. They often argue that the core teachings of Islam are egalitarian and that abuses against women are due to cultural misinterpretations or later additions, such as certain hadiths, not the religion itself. They seek to reform Islam from within and challenge Natasha's more confrontational, secular, and sometimes critical stance toward Islamic texts and traditions. 2. Points of disagreement. A. The source of women's oppression. Natasha's view, she argues that many oppressive practices are directly sanctioned by Islamic texts, Quran and hadiths, and that meaningful change requires confronting these sources openly, even if it means challenging religious authority or advocating for secular reforms. Muslim feminists' view, they claim that the Quran's true spirit is egalitarian and that misogynistic practices are due to misinterpretation, cultural traditions, or fabricated hadiths. They accuse Natasha of conflating culture with religion and of fueling Islamophobia. B. The role of outsiders in reform. Natasha believes that internal reform is often blocked by religious and cultural resistance, and that international pressure and secular legal reforms are necessary to protect women's rights. Muslim feminists argue that change must come from within the Muslim community and that external criticism, especially from someone who has left Islam, is counterproductive and alienating. C. The impact of public critique. Natasha uses her platform to expose abuses, believing that silence perpetuates harm. She is willing to risk backlash to break taboos and spark debate. Muslim feminists accuse Natasha of airing dirty laundry and providing ammunition to anti-Muslim groups. They claim her work undermines the safety and dignity of Muslim communities in the West. 3. Escalation and public debate. Natasha's publications and media appearances provoke strong reactions. Muslim feminists publicly challenge her, sometimes in academic debates or through articles in major newspapers. In the novel, a prominent Muslim feminist professor publishes an article titled, "Oops, She Did It Again," accusing Natasha of fabricating stories, orchestrating conspiracies to defame Islam, and intentionally marrying her half-brother to create scandal. This article is widely circulated and intended to discredit Natasha's work and motives. Natasha, in turn, refutes these accusations, pointing to DNA evidence and the documented realities of abuse she witnessed and experienced. She accuses Muslim feminists of being more dangerous to Muslim women than Muslim men because, in her view, their denial and apologetic perpetuate harmful practices. 4. Consequences and community response. The clash leads to institutional complaints against Natasha at her university, attempts to revoke her academic credentials, and even legal threats from Muslim organizations and embassies. Muslim feminists and their allies accuse Natasha of violating research ethics, misrepresenting Islam, and endangering community cohesion. Natasha's supporters argue that her courage in exposing taboo subjects is necessary for real change, and that attempts to silence her are themselves oppressive. 5. Broader implications. The conflict illustrates a deep divide within diaspora communities about how to address gender-based violence and discrimination through internal reform and reinterpretation, or through open critique and secular activism. It also highlights the risks faced by women who speak out. Natasha receives threats, faces social ostracism, and endures personal attacks, but also inspires others to question and resist oppressive norms. 6. Summary table. Issue: Natasha's position, Muslim feminists' position. Source of oppression rooted in religious texts and law due to culture/misinterpretation. Method of change: external pressure, secular reform, Public critique, internal reform, reinterpretation. Public critique necessary to break silence and spark change, harmful, fuels Islamophobia. Relationship to Islam, critical, left the faith, reformist, committed to Islam. Impact on community, empowers victims, exposes abuses, undermines community, creates backlash. In summary, the clash between Natasha and Muslim feminists in Canada is a central thread in the novel, representing the broader debate about how to confront gender oppression in Muslim societies. Natasha's uncompromising activism and willingness to challenge religious authority put her at odds with Muslim feminists who seek change from within. The conflict is intense, public, and deeply personal, reflecting the high stakes for women's rights, community identity, and the meaning of reform. Here is a summary of the key debates between Natasha and Muslim feminists as depicted in the novel Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. 1. Source of women's oppression. Natasha's position. Natasha argues that many forms of gender oppression, such as polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, FGM, and the lack of women's autonomy, are not just cultural, but are directly sanctioned by Islamic texts, the Quran and Hadiths. She insists that meaningful change requires confronting these sources openly, even if it means challenging religious authority or advocating for secular reforms. Muslim feminists' position. Muslim feminists in Canada claim that the Quran's true spirit is egalitarian and that misogynistic practices are due to misinterpretation, cultural traditions, or fabricated hadiths. They argue that Natasha conflates culture with religion and that her approach fuels Islamophobia and misrepresents Islam. 2. Method of reform and change. Natasha. She believes that internal reform is often blocked by religious and cultural resistance, and that international pressure and secular legal reforms are necessary to protect women's rights. She is willing to use public critique and even external intervention to push for change. Muslim feminists. They argue that change must come from within the Muslim community through reinterpretation and reform of religious texts. They see Natasha's approach as counterproductive, alienating, and as giving ammunition to anti-Muslim groups. 3. Public critique and airing dirty laundry. Natasha. Natasha uses her platform to expose abuses, believing that silence perpetuates harm. She is willing to risk backlash to break taboos and spark debate, and sees public exposure as necessary for real change. Muslim feminists. They accuse Natasha of airing dirty laundry and providing ammunition to anti-Muslim groups. They claim her work undermines the safety and dignity of Muslim communities in the West and increases the risk of backlash and discrimination. 4. Authenticity and motives. Natasha. She is accused by Muslim feminists of fabricating stories, orchestrating conspiracies to defame Islam, and intentionally marrying her half-brother to create scandal. Natasha refutes these accusations, pointing to DNA evidence and the documented realities of abuse she witnessed and experienced. Muslim feminists. They question Natasha's motives, suggesting she is driven by personal trauma, a desire for fame, or even by anti-Muslim bias. They argue that her work is not representative of the majority of Muslim women's experiences. 5. Impact on community and women's rights. Natasha. She argues that her activism empowers victims, exposes abuses, and inspires others to question and resist oppressive norms. She believes that attempts to silence her are themselves oppressive. Muslim feminists. They argue that Natasha's activism undermines community cohesion, creates backlash, and makes it harder for Muslim women to advocate for their rights within their own communities. 6. Debate outcomes and community response. The debates often escalate into public confrontations, with Muslim feminists publishing articles and organizing campaigns to discredit Natasha, while Natasha continues to publish, speak, and advocate for secular reforms. Institutional complaints are filed against Natasha at her university, and legal threats are made by Muslim organizations and embassies. Despite the backlash, Natasha's work gains international attention and sparks broader debates about women's rights, religious reform, and freedom of speech. Summary table. Debate issue: Natasha's position, Muslim feminists' position. Source of oppression rooted in religious texts and law due to culture/misinterpretation. Method of change: external pressure, secular reform, internal reform, reinterpretation. Public critique necessary to break silence harmful, fuels Islamophobia. Authenticity/motives based on evidence and lived experience driven by trauma, bias, or notoriety. Impact on community: empowers victims, exposes abuses, undermines community, creates backlash. In summary, the debates between Natasha and Muslim feminists are intense, public, and deeply personal. They reflect a broader struggle over how to confront gender oppression in Muslim societies, through open critique and secular activism, Natasha, or through internal reform and reinterpretation, Muslim feminists. The conflict is emblematic of the challenges faced by women's rights activists working within and across cultural and religious boundaries. Natasha and her illegitimate child. 8. If you'd like, I can provide direct quotes from the novel illustrating these debates, or focus on a particular event or argument. These debates profoundly shape her strategies, her public profile, and the risks and reach of her advocacy. Here's a summary of the key impacts. 1. Strengthening Natasha's resolve and public voice. The fierce opposition and public criticism from Muslim feminists do not silence Natasha. Instead, they reinforce her determination to speak out. Facing accusations of fabrication, Islamophobia, and personal vendetta, Natasha becomes even more committed to exposing what she sees as the root causes of women's oppression in Muslim societies. The backlash convinces her that silence and denial only perpetuate harm, and she doubles down on her mission to break taboos and challenge both religious and cultural justifications for abuse. 2. Shifting from local to global advocacy. As the debates escalate, moving from academic circles to the media and legal arenas, Natasha's activism evolves from local, community-based work to international advocacy. She becomes a sought-after speaker, publishes widely, and uses her personal story and research to reach audiences far beyond Canada. The controversy and publicity generated by the debates amplify her message, making her a global figure in the fight for women's rights in Muslim. 3. Refining her arguments and evidence. The intense scrutiny from Muslim feminists and their allies forces Natasha to be meticulous in documenting her claims. She relies on DNA evidence, legal records, and first-hand testimony to support her arguments, anticipating challenges to her credibility. The debates push her to clarify her positions, distinguish between cultural and religious sources of oppression, and address counterarguments directly in her writing and public appearances. 4. Facing institutional and legal challenges. The debates lead to institutional complaints against Natasha at her university, attempts to revoke her academic credentials, and even legal threats from Muslim organizations and embassies. These challenges test her resilience and force her to defend her research methods and freedom of speech. The legal and professional risks highlight the dangers faced by activists who confront entrenched systems of power. 5. Inspiring and empowering others. Despite the backlash, Natasha's activism, shaped by these debates, serves as a catalyst for other women and girls to question, resist, and speak out. Her willingness to confront both patriarchal and apologetic narratives inspires others to break their own silence, seek justice, and imagine new possibilities for their lives. The debates, while divisive, help spark broader conversations about women's rights, religious reform, and the limits of internal critique. 6. Personal costs and isolation. The public nature of the debates also brings personal costs. Natasha faces threats, social ostracism, and even violence. She is sometimes isolated from both the Muslim community and mainstream feminist circles, finding herself in a lonely position as a critic from both within and outside the tradition. Yet, these hardships further fuel her sense of moral responsibility and her commitment to advocacy. Legacy and paradigm shift. Ultimately, The debates with Muslim feminists help define Natasha's legacy. She becomes a symbol of uncompromising activism, resilience, and the power of personal testimony. Her work creates a paradigm shift among Muslim women and their allies, challenging silence and sparking new conversations about gender, religion, and human rights, despite, or perhaps because of, the fierce opposition she faces. In summary, the debates with Muslim feminists sharpen Natasha's activism, push her onto a global stage, and make her both a controversial and influential figure. They force her to defend her methods and message, inspire others to resist, and highlight the high personal and professional stakes of challenging deeply rooted systems of gender oppression. Here's how Natasha handles legal and institutional challenges throughout her activism and personal journey. 1. Facing institutional complaints and academic scrutiny. University investigations. After publishing her controversial research and books, Natasha faces formal complaints at her university. Muslim feminists and community groups accuse her of fabricating data, violating research ethics, and misrepresenting Islam. How Natasha responds. She provides thorough documentation, including DNA evidence, legal records, and first-hand testimony, to support her claims. She cooperates with university inquiry committees, which review her work and ultimately find her research to be academically sound and well-documented. Natasha stands by her methodology and refuses to retract her findings, even under pressure. Site turn 4 fetch_file. 2. Legal challenges from community and foreign entities. Lawsuits from embassies and organizations. Muslim organizations and Middle Eastern embassies in Canada file lawsuits against Natasha, accusing her of entering their countries under false pretenses, using a false religious identity or marital status, and of defaming Islam. How Natasha responds. She hires legal counsel and presents evidence that her name changes and religious conversions were legal under Canadian law. Her defense argues that religious identity is a matter of personal freedom in Canada and that visiting religious sites or conducting research is not a criminal act. The court ultimately finds no legal basis for the charges, and Natasha is exonerated. 3. Handling accusations of fabrication and defamation. Public and media attacks. Natasha is accused in the media, notably by Muslim feminists, of fabricating stories, orchestrating conspiracies, and intentionally creating scandal, such as her unwitting incestuous marriage. How Natasha responds. She publicly refutes these accusations, pointing to DNA test results and legal documentation. She uses media interviews and public speaking opportunities to clarify her story and defend her credibility. Natasha refuses to be intimidated or silenced and continues to publish and speak out. 4. Navigating threats and personal safety. Threats and harassment. Natasha receives anonymous threats, faces social ostracism, and is sometimes at risk of violence due to her activism. How Natasha responds. She reports threats to the police and seeks protection when necessary. She remains vigilant but does not allow intimidation to deter her from her advocacy. Natasha's resilience is strengthened by her sense of moral duty and the support of close allies. Site 5. Legal defense strategies. Evidence-based defense. Natasha's legal strategy is rooted in transparency and evidence. She provides official documentation for name changes and religious conversions, submits DNA and paternity test results to courts to verify her claims, argues for academic freedom and freedom of speech, emphasizing that her research is based on lived experience and verifiable facts. Outcome and impact. Vindication and continued advocacy. Despite the legal and institutional challenges, Natasha is repeatedly vindicated by courts and academic committees. These experiences strengthen her resolve and credibility as an activist, highlight the importance of rigorous documentation and legal awareness for activists working in controversial fields, inspire others to speak out, knowing that it is possible to withstand institutional and legal pressure with truth and resilience. In summary, Natasha handles legal and institutional challenges with a combination of meticulous documentation, legal counsel, public transparency, and personal resilience. She refuses to be silenced by intimidation or bureaucratic obstacles, and her ability to withstand these pressures becomes a defining feature of her activism and legacy. Natasha's thesis, core arguments and conclusions. 1. The roots of gender oppression in Islam. Natasha's thesis argues that the oppression of women in many Muslim societies is not merely cultural, but is deeply rooted in Islamic religious texts and laws, specifically the Quran and the Hadiths. She contends that practices such as polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, FGM, wife beating, and the denial of women's autonomy are sanctioned or justified by these texts, and that meaningful reform requires confronting these sources directly. 2. Critique of Muslim feminist apologetic. Natasha is highly critical of Muslim feminists who claim that Islam is inherently egalitarian and that misogynistic practices are due to cultural misinterpretation or fabricated hadiths. She argues that such apologetic perpetuate harm by denying or minimizing the real impact of religious doctrine on women's lives. In her view, these feminists are more dangerous to Muslim women than Muslim men because their denial enables continued abuse. 4. 3. The limits of internal reform. She asserts that internal reform is often blocked by entrenched religious and cultural resistance. Natasha believes that only external pressure, through international advocacy, legal bans, and secular reforms, can effectively protect women and girls from practices like FGM, child marriage, and polygamy. She calls for these practices to be criminalized globally, not just in the West. 4 fetch_4. The power of testimony and exposure. Natasha's thesis emphasizes the importance of breaking the silence around taboo subjects. She uses her own experiences and fieldwork to document abuses, arguing that public exposure and testimony are essential for sparking dialogue, empathy, and change. She believes that silence and shame are tools of control that must be dismantled. 5. The necessity of secularism for women's emancipation. She concludes that true emancipation for Muslim women cannot be achieved as long as religious law governs social life. Natasha advocates for the secularization of Muslim societies, the removal of religious influence from public institutions, and the enforcement of universal human rights standards. 6. The role of the West and international community. Natasha controversially argues that, just as the abolition of slavery in Muslim countries was forced by outside intervention, so too must the emancipation of women be enforced by international pressure and legal action. She acknowledges that this position is unpopular, but insists it is necessary for real change. Key points of Natasha's thesis. Thesis point. Natasha's argument. Source of oppression rooted in Quran and Hadiths, not just culture. Muslim feminist apologetic denial and minimization perpetuate harm. Internal reform often blocked, external pressure is necessary. Testimony and exposure breaking silence is essential for change. Secularism needed for true emancipation of women. International role. Global legal bans and pressure are required. In summary, Natasha's thesis is a bold, evidence-based critique of both religious doctrine and apologetic feminism. She calls for open confrontation with the sources of misogyny in Islamic law, the criminalization of harmful practices, and the secularization of society as prerequisites for women's liberation. Her work is grounded in personal experience, academic research, and a commitment to universal human rights. Natasha's proposed reforms. 1. Criminalization of harmful practices. Natasha calls for the global criminalization of practices such as female genital mutilation (FGM), child marriage, polygamy, wife beating, forced and arranged marriages without consent, honor-based violence. She argues these practices should be outlawed not only in Western countries, but also in Muslim-majority societies, and that legal bans must be enforced with real consequences for violators. 2. Secularization of law and society. Natasha insists that true emancipation for Muslim women requires the secularization of society. She proposes removing religious law, Sharia, from public institutions, schools, and courts, ensuring that civil law, not religious law, Governs issues like marriage, divorce, inheritance, and women's rights. Banning religiously justified gender segregation and discrimination in public life sites. 3. International pressure and enforcement. She advocates for international intervention and pressure to enforce women's rights, arguing that internal reform is often blocked by entrenched religious and cultural resistance. The international community, including Western governments and human rights organizations, should pressure Muslim countries to abolish misogynistic practices. Legal bans and human rights standards should be enforced globally, similar to how the abolition of slavery was imposed on Muslim societies in the past. 4. Educational reform. Natasha proposes reforming school curricula to remove misogynistic teachings and discriminatory religious content, promoting critical thinking, gender equality, and human rights education for both girls and boys, banning corporal punishment and indoctrination that teaches female inferiority or submission. 5. Empowerment and protection of women. She calls for legal protection for women who resist or escape abusive situations, support systems for victims of violence, including shelters, counseling, and legal aid, encouraging women's participation in public life, education, and the workforce without religious restrictions. 6. Challenging religious justifications. Natasha urges open public debate and exposure of religious texts and interpretations that justify gender oppression, encouraging Muslim women and reformers to confront and reject harmful religious doctrines rather than deny or minimize their impact, supporting ex-Muslims, secularists, and reformers who challenge the status quo. 7. Role of testimony and storytelling. She believes in the power of testimony, breaking the silence around taboo subjects such as sexual violence, FGM, and honor killings, using personal stories and research to raise awareness and inspire change. Summary table. Natasha's key reform proposals. Reform area. Natasha's proposal. Harmful practices criminalize FGM, child marriage, polygamy, wife beating, honor violence. Secularization. Remove religious law from public life, enforce civil law for all. International enforcement. Use global pressure and legal standards to force change. Education reform curricula. Ban misogynistic teachings and corporal punishment. Women's empowerment. Legal protection, support services, equal participation. Religious justification. Publicly challenge and debate harmful doctrines. Testimony. Encourage open storytelling to break taboos and inspire reform. In summary, Natasha's proposed reforms are bold, comprehensive, and often controversial. She calls for a combination of legal, social, educational, and international measures to dismantle systems of gender oppression rooted in both culture and religion. Her vision is for a secular, rights-based society where women are protected by law, empowered to speak out, and free from religiously justified harm. Here's a summary of reactions to Natasha's proposed reforms in Muslim communities as depicted in the novel Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. 1. Widespread outrage and backlash. Natasha's calls for the criminalization of practices like FGM, child marriage, polygamy, and her advocacy for secularization and international intervention provoke intense outrage among many Muslims, both in Canada and abroad. Her work is seen by many as a direct attack on Islam, its traditions, and its sacred texts. Community leaders, religious authorities, and even some Muslim feminists accuse her of Islamophobia, betrayal, and of fueling anti-Muslim sentiment. Turn 4fetch_file. 2. And legal pushback. Muslim organizations and embassies in Canada file lawsuits and complaints against Natasha, accusing her of defamation, entering Muslim countries under false pretenses, and misrepresenting Islam. There are attempts to have her removed from her university position, and she faces formal investigations into her research ethics and academic integrity. These institutional responses are meant to discredit her work and silence her activism. Turn 3. Community ostracism and social isolation. Within local Muslim communities, Natasha is ostracized and shunned. She is treated as an outcast, receives threats, and is sometimes blamed for bringing shame and negative attention to the community. Even those who privately agree with some of her criticisms often distance themselves from her publicly, fearing backlash or being labeled as traitors to their faith site. 4. Counternarratives and denial. Muslim feminists and community leaders often respond by denying the religious basis of the practices Natasha criticizes, insisting that such abuses are cultural, not Islamic. They publish articles and organize campaigns to discredit Natasha, accusing her of fabricating stories, orchestrating conspiracies, and intentionally creating scandal. Some claim she is motivated by personal trauma or a desire for notoriety rather than genuine concern for women's rights. 5. Defensive mobilization. In response to Natasha's activism, some Muslim organizations and leaders mobilized defensively, holding public forums, issuing statements, and increasing efforts to present a positive image of Islam. They emphasize the egalitarian aspects of the faith and highlight Muslim women's achievements, while downplaying or denying the existence of the abuses Natasha. 6. Polarization and division. Natasha's reforms and the backlash they provoke lead to deep polarization within Muslim communities. Some individuals, especially women and younger people, are inspired by her courage and begin to question traditional norms. Others become more entrenched in their opposition, viewing any critique as an existential threat to their identity and faith. The debates create rifts not only between Natasha and her critics, but also within families and community groups. 7. International repercussions. Her activism and the controversy it generates attract international attention. While some human rights organizations and secular activists support her, many Muslim-majority countries and diaspora communities react with condemnation, seeing her as a symbol of Western interference and cultural imperialism. 8. Personal threats and danger. Natasha faces serious personal risks as a result of her reforms. She receives anonymous threats, is targeted by hate campaigns, and at times is at risk of violence. The backlash is not only institutional and social, but also deeply personal, affecting her safety and well-being. In summary, reactions to Natasha's proposed reforms in Muslim communities are overwhelmingly negative and defensive, ranging from legal and institutional pushback to social ostracism, public denial, and personal threats. While her activism inspires some to question and resist oppressive norms, it also provokes fierce backlash, polarization, and efforts to silence her voice. The novel portrays these reactions as both a testament to the power of her advocacy and a reflection of the immense challenges faced by those who confront deeply rooted systems of gender oppression. Here is a summary of the debate between Natasha and the American Muslim feminist professor as depicted in the novel Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. Context. The debate is organized by the Department of Islamic Studies at McGill University, Canada. Natasha, now a PhD and outspoken critic of gender oppression in Muslim societies, faces off against Professor Layla Hassan, a prominent American Muslim feminist and Harvard professor. The topic is the equality versus inequality of men and women in Islam. Main arguments. Natasha's position. No equality in Islam. Natasha argues that the Quran and Hadiths explicitly allow practices such as polygamy, wife-beating, child marriage, and female genital mutilation, and that these are not merely cultural but religiously sanctioned. She cites specific verses and hadiths to support her claims, including the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Aisha and the Quranic verses on polygamy and wife-beating. Religious law versus women's rights. She asserts that as long as Sharia law governs family and social life, women cannot achieve equality or autonomy. She points out that women cannot divorce their husbands, have limited rights to child custody, and are subject to discriminatory inheritance and testimony laws. Critique of feminist apologetic. Natasha challenges Muslim feminists for denying or minimizing the religious basis of these practices, arguing that such denial perpetuates harm and blocks meaningful reform. Professor Layla Hassan's position. Egalitarian spirit of the Quran. Professor Layla argues that the Quran's true spirit is egalitarian and that any misogynistic practices are due to cultural traditions or later misinterpretations. She claims that polygamy is discouraged by the Quran, that wife-beating is limited or symbolic, and that child marriage was a pre-Islamic custom not endorsed by the faith. Reform from within. She insists that change must come from within the Muslim community, through reinterpretation and reform of religious texts, and that external critique is counterproductive and fuels Islamophobia. Selective acceptance of hadiths. Layla argues that only hadiths consistent with the Quran's egalitarian message should be accepted, and that others are fabrications or misinterpretations. Escalation and outcome. The debate becomes heated, with Natasha pressing Layla on contradictions and the practical realities faced by women in Muslim societies. Layla becomes increasingly defensive, eventually resorting to personal attacks and vulgar language, leading to her disqualification from the debate and a ban from the university. The outcome is widely seen as a victory for Natasha, whose arguments are grounded in textual evidence and lived experience, while Layla's position is perceived as evasive and apologetic. Significance. The debate highlights the deep divide between secular critics of Islamic law and reformist Muslim feminists. It exposes the challenges of reconciling religious tradition with universal human rights and the difficulties faced by those who seek to reform from within versus those who advocate for external critique and secularization. Natasha's victory in the debate boosts her public profile and further polarizes opinion within academic and Muslim communities. Site turn 4fetch_file. In summary, the debate between Natasha and the American professor centers on whether gender inequality in Muslim societies is rooted in religious texts or cultural misinterpretation. Natasha's evidence-based critique clashes with Layla's reformist apologetic, resulting in a dramatic and public confrontation that underscores the complexities of religious reform and women's rights activism. Natasha's key arguments. Inequality is rooted in Islamic texts. Natasha argues that the Quran and hadiths explicitly allow and even encourage practices such as polygamy, wife-beating, child marriage, and female genital mutilation. She cites specific verses and hadiths to show these are not just cultural but religiously sanctioned. Religious law blocks women's rights. She asserts that as long as Sharia law governs family and social life, women cannot achieve equality or autonomy. She points to discriminatory laws on divorce, child custody, inheritance, and testimony. Critique of feminist apologetic. Natasha challenges Muslim feminists for denying or minimizing the religious basis of these practices, arguing that such denial perpetuates harm and blocks meaningful reform. Need for secular reform and external pressure. She insists that only secularization and international legal pressure can bring about real change for women in Muslim societies. Professor Layla Hassan's key arguments. Egalitarian spirit of the Quran. Layla argues that the Quran's true spirit is egalitarian and that misogynistic practices are due to cultural traditions or later misinterpretations. She claims polygamy is discouraged, wife-beating is symbolic or limited, and child marriage is a pre-Islamic custom not endorsed by Islam. Reform from within. She insists that change must come from within the Muslim community, through reinterpretation and reform of religious texts, and that external critique is counterproductive and fuels Islamophobia. Selective acceptance of hadiths. Layla argues that only hadiths consistent with the Quran's egalitarian message should be accepted, and that others are fabrications or misinterpretations. Debate dynamics and outcome. Natasha presses Layla on contradictions and the practical realities faced by women in Muslim societies, using textual evidence and lived experience. Layla becomes defensive, eventually resorting to personal attacks, which leads to her disqualification from the debate. The outcome is widely seen as a victory for Natasha, whose arguments are grounded in evidence and experience, while Layla's position is perceived as apologetic and evasive. In summary, the debate centers on whether gender inequality in Muslim societies is rooted in religious texts or cultural misinterpretation. Natasha's evidence-based critique clashes with Layla's reformist apologetic, resulting in a dramatic confrontation that underscores the complexities of religious reform and women's rights activism. Natasha's main evidence in the debate with the American Muslim feminist professor centers on direct references to Islamic texts and lived realities. Here's a summary of her key evidence. 1. Quranic verses and hadiths. Natasha cites specific verses from the Quran and authentic hadiths to demonstrate that practices such as polygamy, wife-beating, child marriage, and female genital mutilation are not merely cultural, but are explicitly permitted or encouraged in Islamic scripture. For example, polygamy. She references Surah Al-Nisa 4:3, which allows men to marry up to 4 wives. Wife-beating. She cites Surah Al-Nisa 4:34, which permits husbands to beat disobedient wives. Child marriage. She points to the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Aisha, referencing hadiths that state he married her at 6 and consummated the marriage at 9. FGM. She refers to hadiths that mention and endorse female circumcision, arguing that these are used as religious justification for the practice. 2. Legal and social practices. Natasha brings in evidence from her fieldwork and personal experience, describing how these religious texts are used to justify arranged and forced marriages of underage girls, the expectation of female submission and obedience, the denial of women's right to divorce, child custody, and equal inheritance, the normalization of corporal punishment and honor-based violence. She challenges the American professor's selective acceptance of hadiths, arguing that the most authoritative collections, Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, are universally accepted in the formation of Sharia law. Natasha points out that reformist claims about egalitarian spirit are contradicted by the actual content and historical application of Islamic law. 4. Lived experience and testimony. Natasha uses her own story and the stories of women she encountered in Sudan and Saudi Arabia as evidence of the real-world consequences of these doctrines. She describes the trauma of FGM and child marriage, the legal and social barriers to justice for women, the silencing and punishment of those who resist or question these norms. 5. Academic and legal documentation. She supports her arguments with DNA evidence and legal records in the context of her own life and research, documentation of court cases, punishments, and the treatment of women under Sharia law, references to academic studies and international human rights reports on the prevalence and impact of these practices in Muslim societies. In summary, Natasha's main evidence in the debate is a combination of direct scriptural citations, lived experience, legal documentation, and academic research. She uses these to argue that gender inequality and harmful practices are rooted in Islamic law and tradition, and that meaningful reform requires confronting these sources openly rather than denying or minimizing their impact. Natasha's evidence during her public debates and activism had a profound and polarizing impact on public opinion, both within Muslim communities and in the broader society. 1. Credibility and influence among non-Muslims and reformers. Natasha's use of direct citations from the Quran and hadiths, combined with her personal testimony and field research, made her arguments compelling to many outside the Muslim community and to secular reformers. Her evidence-based approach, including DNA results and legal documentation, was seen as rigorous and difficult to dismiss. This credibility helped her gain a platform in international media, academic circles, and among human rights organizations, amplifying her voice and message. 2. Polarization within Muslim communities. Her evidence, especially when it involved quoting religious texts to justify practices like polygamy, FGM, and child marriage, provoked intense backlash among many Muslims. Community leaders, religious authorities, and even some Muslim feminists accused her of misrepresenting Islam, fueling Islamophobia and betraying her heritage. Many saw her as attacking the faith itself, rather than just critiquing harmful practices. This led to widespread outrage, legal complaints, and efforts to discredit her work site. 3. Defensive mobilization and counternarratives. In response to Natasha's evidence, Muslim organizations and feminists mobilized to defend their faith's image. They published counterarticles, organized public forums, and emphasized the egalitarian aspects of Islam. Some accused Natasha of fabricating stories or orchestrating conspiracies, while others insisted that the abuses she described were cultural, not religious. This defensive stance often deepened divisions within the community and made open dialogue more. 4. Inspiration for victims and reformers. Despite the backlash, Natasha's willingness to present hard evidence and break taboos inspired many women and girls, especially those who had experienced similar abuses. Her testimony encouraged others to question traditional norms, seek justice, and speak out about their own experiences. For some, her activism planted seeds of doubt about the status quo and sparked new conversations about women's rights and religion. 5. Social and institutional consequences. The controversy generated by Natasha's evidence led to institutional investigations, legal challenges, and even threats to her safety. While some academic and legal bodies vindicated her, the public debate around her work became a flashpoint for broader discussions about freedom of speech, academic integrity, and the boundaries of religious critique. The intense scrutiny also forced Natasha to be meticulous in her documentation and public statements. 6. Long-term impact. Over time, Natasha's evidence-based activism contributed to a paradigm shift in how issues of gender oppression in Muslim societies were discussed in Canada and internationally. While she remained a polarizing figure, her work made it harder for communities to ignore or deny the realities she exposed, and it encouraged a more open, if contentious, public conversation about religion, culture, and women's rights. In summary, Natasha's evidence influenced public opinion by lending credibility and urgency to her cause among reformers and outsiders, while provoking defensive backlash and polarization within Muslim communities. Her activism inspired some to seek change and forced a broader reckoning with uncomfortable truths, even as it made her a target for criticism and controversy. Similar activism. Here's a summary of public reactions in Western media to Natasha's reforms and activism. 1. Widespread visibility and media attention. Natasha's activism and outspoken critique of gender oppression in Muslim societies receive significant coverage in Western media. She is often portrayed as a courageous whistleblower and a symbol of resistance against patriarchal and religiously justified abuses. Her story is featured in interviews, documentaries, and news articles, and she is invited to speak at international conferences and on major news channels. 2. Framing as a media darling and exception. Western media frequently frame Natasha as an exceptional Muslim or ex-Muslim woman, someone who embodies Western ideals of feminism, secularism, and individual rights. This media darling trope highlights her Western education, outspokenness, and willingness to confront taboo subjects, sometimes at the expense of recognizing the diversity of voices within Muslim communities. Support from human rights and feminist organizations. Many Western human rights groups, secular feminist organizations, and academic circles rally behind Natasha's cause. They use her story to advocate for global women's rights, legal reforms, and the need to challenge religious justifications for gender-based violence. Her evidence-based approach is often cited as a model for effective activism. 4. Critique of cultural relativism. Natasha's activism is sometimes used in Western media to critique cultural relativism, the idea that harmful practices should be tolerated in the name of respecting cultural or religious differences. Her testimony is invoked to argue that universal human rights should take precedence over cultural or religious norms when it comes to women's safety and dignity. 5. Orientalist and rescue narrative critiques. Some scholars and commentators caution that Western media's embrace of Natasha can reinforce Orientalist stereotypes, portraying Muslim societies as uniquely repressive and in need of Western intervention. Critics argue that this rescue narrative risks oversimplifying complex issues and marginalizing Muslim women who seek reform from within their own religious or 6. Polarization and backlash. While Natasha is celebrated in many Western outlets, her activism also sparks debate about Islamophobia, secularism, and the boundaries of free speech. Some Muslim organizations and progressive groups in the West criticize the media for amplifying voices that they see as hostile to Islam or for failing to include more nuanced, reformist Muslim perspectives. 7. Impact on public discourse. Overall, Natasha's story and evidence-based activism contribute to a more open, if sometimes contentious, public conversation about women's rights, religious reform, and multiculturalism in the West. Her work is credited with raising awareness, inspiring policy debates, and encouraging other survivors and activists to speak out. In summary, Western media largely respond to Natasha's reforms with admiration and support, framing her as a brave advocate for universal women's rights. However, this coverage is not without controversy. It sometimes reinforces rescue narratives and Orientalist tropes, and it provokes debate about cultural sensitivity, Islamophobia, and the best path to gender justice in diverse societies. Here is a summary of Muslim community responses to Western media coverage of Natasha's activism and reforms. 1. Perception of bias and Islamophobia. Many in the Muslim community view Western media coverage of Natasha's activism as biased, sensationalist, and Islamophobic. They argue that the media often frames Natasha as a heroic savior while portraying Muslim societies as uniquely backward or violent. This framing is seen as reinforcing negative stereotypes and fueling anti-Muslim sentiment in Western societies. 2. Defensive and reactive mobilization. Muslim organizations and leaders respond to Western media coverage by increasing their own public relations efforts. They issue statements, hold forums, and publish articles to counter what they see as misrepresentations of Islam and Muslim communities. These efforts often emphasize the egalitarian aspects of Islam, highlight positive stories about Muslim women, and insist that abuses are cultural, not religious. 3. Accusations of betrayal and airing dirty laundry. Natasha is frequently accused by Muslim community members of betraying her heritage and airing dirty laundry to outsiders. There is a strong sentiment that internal problems should be addressed within the community, not exposed to Western audiences who may not understand the complexities involved. Some accuse Natasha of seeking fame or validation from non-Muslims at the expense of her own community. 4. Community ostracism and social pressure. Those who publicly support Natasha or echo her criticisms often face ostracism, social isolation, or even threats. The backlash is not limited to Natasha herself, but can extend to her family, friends, and allies. This creates a chilling effect, discouraging open discussion or support for reforms that are perceived as aligning with Western criticism. 5. Counternarratives and denial. Muslim feminists and community leaders frequently respond by denying the religious basis of the practices Natasha criticizes, insisting that such abuses are cultural deviations. They publish counter-articles and organize campaigns to discredit Natasha, sometimes accusing her of fabrication or exaggeration. There is also an effort to present alternative narratives that emphasize Muslim women's agency and achievements. 6. Concerns about rescue narratives and Orientalism. Some Muslim intellectuals and activists express concern that Western media's embrace of Natasha reinforces rescue narratives and Orientalist tropes, portraying Muslim women as passive victims in need of Western intervention. They argue that this undermines local reform efforts and marginalizes voices seeking change from within the community. 7. Legal and institutional pushback. In response to the publicity generated by Western media, Muslim organizations and embassies sometimes pursue legal action or institutional complaints against Natasha, aiming to discredit her work or silence her activism. These efforts are often justified as protecting the community from defamation or external. In summary, Muslim community responses to Western media coverage of Natasha's activism are overwhelmingly defensive and critical. Many see the coverage as biased and harmful, reinforcing stereotypes and undermining internal reform. The backlash includes public denials, counter-narratives, social ostracism, and even legal action, reflecting deep anxieties about representation, identity, and the struggle for change in the face of external scrutiny. Social ostracism has a profound and complex impact on Natasha's activism. 1. Isolation and personal hardship. Natasha faces widespread ostracism from Muslim communities, both in Canada and abroad. She is shunned, treated as an outcast, and sometimes even threatened. This isolation extends to her family and allies, making her personal life more difficult and emotionally taxing. The lack of community support means Natasha often has to rely on her own resilience and a small circle of trusted friends. 2. Strengthening her resolve. Rather than silencing her, social ostracism often strengthens Natasha's determination to speak out. The backlash and exclusion she experiences reinforce her belief that silence and denial perpetuate harm. The more she is pushed to the margins, the more committed she becomes to exposing abuses and advocating for women's rights, even at great personal cost. 3. Impact on strategy and messaging. Ostracism forces Natasha to be meticulous in her documentation and public statements. Knowing that her critics are eager to discredit her, she relies on rigorous evidence, such as DNA tests, legal records, and first-hand testimony, to support her claims. This careful approach helps her withstand institutional and legal challenges and bolsters her credibility among supporters. 4. Limiting local support, expanding global reach. While ostracism limits Natasha's ability to build alliances within Muslim communities, it paradoxically increases her visibility and support in broader, especially Western, circles. Human rights organizations, secular feminists, and international media often rally behind her, amplifying her message and giving her a global platform. 5. Inspiring others despite risks. Despite the risks, Natasha's willingness to endure ostracism and continue her activism inspires other women and girls, especially those who have experienced similar abuses. Her example encourages others to question oppressive norms, seek justice, and speak out, even when it means facing exclusion or hostility from their own community. 6. Personal cost and resilience. The social exclusion Natasha faces comes at a high personal cost: emotional distress, threats to her safety, and a sense of loneliness. However, these hardships also fuel her sense of moral responsibility and her commitment to advocacy. Natasha's resilience in the face of ostracism becomes a defining feature of her activism and legacy. In summary, social ostracism isolates Natasha from her community and creates significant personal hardship, but it also strengthens her resolve, sharpens her activism, and inspires others. While it limits her local support, it expands her global reach and cements her role as a courageous and uncompromising advocate for women's rights. Natasha's support network is complex, evolving, and at times fragile, but it plays a crucial role in her survival and activism. 1. Immediate family and close friends. Her brother Wahid is one of Natasha's most steadfast supporters. He provides emotional, financial, and practical help, especially during her time in Sudan and after her return to Canada. He listens to her story, encourages her to seek justice, and helps care for her children when she is away or in danger. Almaz Abraha, Wahid's Ethiopian wife and Natasha's close friend, Almaz, offers Natasha emotional support, stability, and practical help with her children. Almaz's presence provides Natasha with a sense of family and belonging, especially when she is ostracized by others. 2. Allies in academia and human rights circles. Academic colleagues. While Natasha faces institutional challenges, some colleagues in academia recognize the rigor and importance of her research. They support her during university investigations and help defend her academic human rights and women's rights activists. After her story gains international attention, Natasha receives support from human rights organizations, women's rights groups, and secular feminist circles. These allies amplify her voice, provide platforms for her advocacy, and sometimes offer legal or logistical assistance far-fetched understudy. Students and young women. Students at the girls' school. In Sudan, Natasha becomes a mentor and confidant to many girls at the school where she volunteers. She provides them with emotional support, encourages critical thinking, and inspires some to question oppressive norms, even at great personal risk. Women and girls inspired by her activism. Natasha's courage and willingness to break taboos inspire other women and girls, both in Sudan and in the diaspora, to seek help, resist, or speak out about their own experiences. 4. Legal and professional support. Lawyers and legal advocates. When Natasha faces lawsuits and institutional complaints, she is able to secure legal representation. Her lawyers help her navigate complex legal challenges, defend her rights, and present evidence in court. 5. Personal resilience. Her own inner strength. Perhaps most importantly, Natasha's greatest support comes from her own resilience, determination, and sense of moral duty. Even when isolated or betrayed, she draws on her inner resources to survive, heal, and continue her advocacy. In summary, Natasha's support network is a mix of close family, especially her brother and friend Alma's, a few trusted allies in academia and activism, students and women inspired by her, legal advocates, and her own inner strength. While often fragile and tested by ostracism, this network is vital to her survival, healing, and ongoing fight for women's rights.